There are a few characters that we see hanging from a ceiling or chained to a wall or imprisoned in some kind of way more often than Vasher, the title character of the novel Warbreaker. And he's also one of the characters that honestly like has enough names and aliases across the Cosmere to rival somebody like Wit or Hoyd. So in this video, and I've been wanting to do this for a while, I want to do a deep dive into Vasher, think about kind of what we know about him and what his goals are, especially as he world hops across the Cosmere. But this video will include spoilers for, as I've mentioned, Warbreaker. It will also include spoilers for all of the Stormlight archive up until the end of Wind and Truth. And I'll reference something in Mistborn, but I'm not planning to spoil anything in Mistborn. So with that, let's get into it. And just a reminder that if you like this kind of content, please subscribe to the channel. I post on all things Cosmere on a weekly basis. Okay, who is he? So for my Stormlight archive viewers, when I say Vasher, I'm talking about none other than Zahel, who is Adolin and Renarin and eventually Kaladin's like mysterious, somewhat infuriating swordmaster. And in the Stormlight archive, we see Zahel working in Dalinar's camp. That's kind of how we're introduced to him as the swordmaster. He trains all of these characters on dueling, and he's often described physically as having kind of like a scruffy, untamed beard and ragged clothing that's belted with a rope. And he, in that context, he stands like a little bit apart from the other swordmasters or the other duelists or ardents in Dalinar's camp because he's like kind of like entirely inscrutable to the characters around him. And he always makes these like kind of weird, that we know as readers as Cosmere references, but that as the characters in the book are mostly just confusing. And actually, in Rhythm of War, we see what I think is the best description for Zahel as that I've seen yet, which is Kaladin describes him, notes that like his ragged appearance is kind of purposeful or intentional, and describes him as, quote unquote, a masterpiece painting intentionally hung in a splintered frame. And I love that description for Zahel or Vasher. It shows, for one, that he's posturing. He pretends to be more low-key than he actually is. And that's because he's not actually from Roshar. For one, he is, as I mentioned, Vasher from the planet Nalthis, where Warbreaker is set. And on Nalthis itself, he himself is this like near mythological character by the time we see him in Warbreaker. In fact, who he is Khalad, or Khalad, I don't know how you pronounce it, K-A-L-A-D, who is, as I said, like this like near mythological character who started and then ended the Many War, which is like the biggest conflict that has happened on the planet Nalthis to date, one of the biggest clashes on the planet. And I gave this a little bit of thought, is the similarity between Kaladin, who Zahel or Vasher trains, versus Vasher's like AKA or alias Khalad, and whether there's a connection between them. And I honestly don't feel like I know the answer, but what I do feel like I know is that in the Cosmere and in Brandon Sanderson's works, names mean a lot. I don't know. Tell me what you think in the comments, but are Khalad, Vasher, aka Khalad, and Kaladin, who he eventually trains, are they related? I don't know. And just to be clear, the reason that we know that Vasher and Zahel are the same people is because it is confirmed, it's hinted, honestly, like across the first 4 books, but it's confirmed in Wind and Truth, where we see Axwindeth, while she's torturing Zahel, refer to him as Vasher. And I think there's no doubt that they are the same character by the time that Wind and Truth concludes. And just to remind everyone that Axwindeth's kind of connection between the two, the reason this matters is because she is also a non-Rosharan on Roshar, so she has this level of Cosmere awareness about some of these world hoppers that we can't assume that other Rosharans do. Personally, I love that Vasher, aka Zahel, aka Kalad, that his defining trait on Roshar is that he is a sword master, he's a trainer, is because when we see him a few hundred years prior in Warbreaker, he's essentially a pacifist, but with temper control issues, which makes him like a really crappy duelist. And so by the time 300 years, roughly 300, 200 years later, we see him in Roshar, teaching these like calming exercises about like centering your mind, or like katas. It shows, I think, that in the last few hundred years, he has grown as a character and as a person in controlling that temper that we see in Warbreaker, and he's then teaching some of that growth to others, which I think is really quite lovely. And this development kind of puts a humanizing face, honestly, on a character that is like too cool for school on Roshar, and when we see him in the Stormlight archive, and is like very cynical and very curmudgeonly. And so before I turn to what Vasher or Zahel is actually doing on Roshar, I want to talk a little bit about his backstory on Nalthis, i.e. where he comes from before he comes to Roshar. For one, a big piece of that backstory is that he is what is known on the planet Nalthis as a returned. And we don't actually know, and what that means in practice is that somebody on Nalthis that has committed some sort of courageous, heroic act that has led them to be endowed with another life, or endowed with an investiture, leading to another life by the shard on the planet Nalthis, who is endowment. And so Vasher, as a return, we don't actually know anything about his original life, the part that led him to be restored back to life. But what we do know, and from Warbreaker, is that he is one of the members of the Returned. In Rhythm of War, Vasher describes himself as a Type 2 invested entity. Basically somebody who died with too much investiture, or becomes endowed with too much investiture as they die, basically leaving behind a shadow that can then be nailed back onto a soul, i.e. a cognitive shadow. And that's what happens to Vasher. He doesn't remember his original life. In fact, he explains that in Rhythm of War as well. He says that that's why when, basically like a Type 2 invested entity like himself, that's why when that is made, she, i.e. the shard endowment, takes our memories. She knows that we aren't the actual people who died, but something else given a corpse to inhabit. And while this idea that somebody committing a heroic act is then brought back to life, I think is like kind of a good thing in many ways if you take it at like face value, it does show, I think, that Vasher views that gift as with some level of cynicism, or at least like some level of like conflicted feelings. Following his return or resurrection, Vasher becomes known as Tax or Talaxin, and he becomes one of the five scholars on Nalthis who generate some of the biggest breakthroughs in like technological innovation on Nalthis, in basically like how to use investiture in new and unique ways. And in that role, he participates in the forming of Nightblood. And honestly, like, I'm probably gonna do a whole other video about Nightblood because there's so much to say here. But for the purposes of this video, I'll just say that Nightblood is, the way that Vasher himself describes it, is a Type 4 biochromatic entity, which is basically like awakened steel object that has become sentient, i.e. that it can like think for itself, which is like incredibly hard to do and may never have been replicated before or since in the Cosmere. And so Vasher's role in creating Nightblood is like a hugely significant innovation on Nalthis and actually in the Cosmere. He wasn't the primary creator, to be clear, of Nightblood. when I say participated in the creation of Nightblood, what I mean is that he and his eventual wife, Roshar, formed Nightblood together. And so in some ways, Nightblood is like kind of Vasher's like kid. The discoveries that Tax or Talaxin makes as one of the 5 scholars, to include Nightblood, but in that's one piece of it, ends up fueling the Many War, which, as I mentioned earlier, is a global conflict on Nalthis. And Vasher's role in it is significant. He raises a vast army to fight the war, especially as the 5 scholars splinter and take up different factions. And while Vasher is one of the perpetrators of the war, he is also the person that ends the Many War. And in that role, he takes on yet another of his many monikers, where he's known as Peacegiver or Warbreaker. And just to clarify, there's a lot that we don't know about the Many War or about Vasher's role in it. But what we do know is that he had a role in his technological innovations, or the role of the 5 scholars certainly compounded the impact on ordinary people of this global conflict, and that Vasher, seeing that, felt compelled to stop it in some capacity, which then left this like kind of lasting scar in the man that we know as Vasher or Zahel today. And I don't know why Tax or Talaxin as the 5 scholars ended up taking on the name of Vasher. In Warbreaker, Denth explains that it's his idea of a joke and that he appropriated the name from somebody else. And honestly, like, I can't figure out what the joke is. The only thing that I can think of is that it's kind of similar to Washer, like a laundryman. And we do see him on laundry duties in the Stormlight archive, which makes me think that, I don't know, is there like some kind of joke there? I don't know. Tell me what you think in the comments. So chronologically, just to be clear, by the time we see Vasher as Vasher in Warbreaker, it had been 300 years since the Many War and his role in, as I said, like perpetuating and then ending that conflict. And then by the time we see him on Roshar, it's been about a few hundred years by my count, from the time that he's world hopped there. And so as Zahel, I think we can assume that he's about 500 or 600 years old on Roshar when he's training Kaladin, Adolin, and Renarin. And that doesn't include the length of his first life, which is that we don't know anything about, prior to the point that he becomes a returned. Okay, so what the heck is Vasher doing on Roshar? How did he land up there? And why did he make his way to Dalinar's war camps of all places? So to answer that, I think like one key motivation that we certainly know about Vasher, Kalad, Zahel, whatever we want to call him, is that he wants to give up fighting. I talked about his role in the Many War, of course, but during, some point during the time of his relocation from Nalthis to Roshar, he gives up Nightblood, which is, as I mentioned, like basically like his kid, like his creation, part of his creation. And he tells Kaladin that he considers himself one of the quote-unquote worn out soldiers of the world, the men with souls so thin that they shiver in a stiff breeze. And he talks about how no matter what he tries, conflict will find men. And so he no longer wants a part in trying to stop it or shape it in some way. And so I think like one motivation is this like really cynical perspective on life, suggesting that what he's doing on Roshar is basically running from responsibility. And we do see that a little bit with Vivenna or Azure, who is looking for him. And he kind of references her when he says like he recognizes that he abandoned the woman that believed in him by running from his responsibilities. But honestly, I don't actually buy it. I definitely think that Vasher wants to be done with like fighting for what he perceives as good and failing in some ways, and he wants to retire or escape from the responsibility of saving the Cosmere, but I don't think he's capable of doing it. And in fact, by virtue of the way that we see him as Zahel on Roshar of training soldiers, shows that he can't walk away from the conflict. Adolin, Renarin, Kaladin, these are some of the people that will shape the future of Roshar. And in fact, Adolin says that Zahel tells him that he considers himself, Zahel considers himself, a coward for not walking away from the sword entirely and training others for battle. Because while it is the last option of a state, it's still better than having no options for a state or force for good. Secondly, he also can't actually give up Nightblood entirely. What we learned in Wind and Truth is that he visits Szeth, who holds Nightblood. He certainly hasn't abandoned which shows I think he hasn't abandoned Nightblood. And by someone who knows how destructive Nightblood can be, as I mentioned, this kind of like singular creation in the Cosmere, the fact that he's comfortable leaving it in Szeth's hands is really interesting. And for some of the viewers that are watching, like, how did Szeth get Nightblood? Stay tuned, because I do want to do a whole video on Nightblood. The third reason why I think Vasher Zahel doesn't walk away from the conflict entirely is that we see him get really excited in Wind and Truth about training Lift. He's so excited to see the raw talent that she holds. And so after the events of Wind and Truth conclude, if he is able to kind of take what he's learned over the centuries and train up Lift, she's going to be crazy powerful, because she's the only character left on Roshar that can channel investiture, that can channel lifelight. And so her role, I think, will be pivotal. Okay, but if we've established that Vasher can't actually like walk away from responsibility entirely, what actually are his like proactive goals? And here's my theory, is that I think what Vasher is trying to do is to get rid of investiture or magic or shards entirely from the Cosmere. In one of the craziest, like, blink or you'll miss it developments in Wind of Truth, we learn that Vasher is helping Gavilar. And specifically what he helps Gavilar do is get anti-void light. In the prologue of Wind and Truth, Gavilar kind of like at one point like smirks to himself that no one knows of the quote-unquote secret scholar that he keeps in reserve, a master of all things scientific, a man from another world, which I am certain can only be a scholar from another world in Kholinar, can only be Vasher Zahel. And the discovery that Vasher makes and gives to Gavilar basically is a form of anti-light which can destroy void light, so anti-void light, which also eventually passes to Szeth. It's a discovery that Navani uses to discover the thing that can kill Stormlight, i.e. anti-Stormlight. So basically Vasher gifts Gavilar, through his like scientific prowess essentially, he gifts Gavilar the ability to destroy investiture on Roshar. Nightblood, of course, his creation, or with Roshar, his creation Nightblood, which I mentioned is with Szeth, willingly, as Vasher knows, is also one of the few things in the Cosmere that can kill investiture or can kill a shard. We see Nightblood kill investiture in that he kills Race, the shard that carried Odium, in Rhythm of War. And Nightblood, I think, we learn, can also collapse a perpendicularity. So Nightblood is able to suck in investiture in a way that very few other things in the Cosmere can. I think this theory is buttressed by a line in Rhythm of War as well, where when Kaladin asks Zahel, or Vasher, if he believes in God or the Almighty, he answers, I don't need to, because I know gods exist, I simply hate them. And so I think while Vasher Zahel's like purpose has been to try to like or stated purpose has been a walk away from all of this responsibility, I think what it's led him to do is basically function as like the Cosmere version of an anarchist, where he basically wants to just get rid of investiture and the shard's endowment of investiture across the Cosmere. And I think he may be nudging events along on Roshar to that end. And so in some ways, I view Vasher as kind of this like tragic character, because we see him desperately seek to destroy evil, for example, in the creation of Nightblood, but actually ends up perpetuating evil. We see him seek to, I think, like potentially destroy investiture or magic systems, but is a shadow or a creature, a person that is created from investiture by virtue of being returned. And he seeks to, I think, like run from responsibility, but can't help take on responsibility by the time he gets to Roshar. So he's just like this character of contrast in my mind. And I think there's some level of tragedy to that, because we just can't see him reach an equilibrium. Okay, so what do you think? This is my deep dive into Vasher. We haven't even talked about how he has all of these breaths that he's been able to transport from Nalthis to Roshar. That's a whole other video that I want to do about transporting investiture. But I'd love to know what you think about Vasher, Zahel, Khalid, Tax, Talaxin, Warbreaker, Strifelover, Peacegiver, like the person with like some of the most aliases in the Cosmere. Tell me what you think, and tell me if you missed anything, if I missed anything in the comments below, please. And as I mentioned up front, if you like this kind of content, please subscribe to the channel. It really does help the channel out. Thank you, everyone.